Thanks very much, Ronaldo. Our next presenter this afternoon is Rachel Price, who grew up in Massachusetts, received her BA from Yale, and earned her PhD from Duke University in 2007. Before she came to Princeton to work as an assistant professor in 2009, she held a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship and worked as a professor of Hispanic languages and literatures at the universities of Boston and Stony Brook. Her work is mainly on Latin American, circum-Atlantic, and particularly Cuban literature and culture, media, and comparative imperialism. She has published articles and given conferences on the relics and spirit of José Martí in Cuban literature, affect and slavery in 19th century Cuba, and concrete and post-concrete media art and poetry in Brazil since 1968. Currently, she's completing a book tentatively entitled The Object of the Atlantic, Concretude, where she traces the cultural transformations in the Iberian Atlantic from a preoccupation with subjectivity and sovereignty to a global model concerned with objects, neocolonialism, and consumption. She is currently working on a project on communication in 19th century Cuba, part of which she will share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Rachel.
Do you have the password? No. Oh. I think we need someone that has the password for this computer. This is the administrator computer.
We can use your computer if I use the same.
Maybe it's a good idea.
Sorry about this.
This is the computer provided by the conference, but...
Do you mind?
Oh, no, I don't mind at all. Let me help you. So... see, right? This one?
Yeah, exactly. That's
This
it.
one?
Mhm. See what's going on.
Let me do something else. It's much better.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Then
It's okay.
It's okay now. This is mine, I guess. This was here, right?
Okay, sorry about that.
Most important thing.
Thank you, Pedro, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here this afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Sure.
Thank
Great.
you. And thanks to the other presenters for such a wonderful antecedents. So I was going to speak today on less the side of delicacy than the side of opacity and transparency. When Pedro wrote to invite us to participate in this panel, he framed the discussion in terms of several open-ended questions. Can you hear me fine through here? Okay. At a spring symposium on delicadeza, he had spoken of delicacy, including the perils of pinning down the ineffable. Some of the question framing today's panel, however, which Pedro sent us as prompts, seem to move away from the aesthetic object and towards critics' relationship to studying culture. When addressing works of art, what do we risk in revelation? When does transparency become surveillance? We seek transparency in our work, but we must believe the objects we study are not self-evident. What would be the work of interpretation if the art or literature were already transparent? Before cultural objects purported opaqueness, we imagine our illumination as shedding light, arrojando luz, or jogando luz sobre. This metaphor, which imagines a beam moving towards the object to illuminate hidden truth with force, perhaps reveals more about the act of interpretation than it means to. The beam itself is a source of information. We can guess this from cosmography. Light does not simply emanate towards something, but gives us information about its source. We know about the composition of the sun and other stars because in the light that reaches us, some colors have been suppressed as atoms in the sun have absorbed them. Since different atoms absorb different colors, we can deduce from the light that reaches the earth which atoms are present in the sun. Interpretation is also a two-way street, or better, a crossroads, especially when what one is interpreting is interpretation. Translators. My talk today is drawn from research I did last June on interpreters from African languages in 19th century Cuban court cases. What little we know about these interpreters emerges from the records, but some of what we see there is that the other information was absorbed at the source. A crossroads itself, Cuba from its earliest days employed official translators. Their work was done in various European languages and consisted principally of checking ships' bills of lading to prevent fraud. The mixed courts of justice for the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade, established in Havana, Rio, Freetown, Paramaribo in 1819, also used translators and interpreters, as did ships inspecting contraband slave cargoes. Slavers too used interpreters to aid in the capture and transport of slaves. But I was looking at cases involving interpreters used in Cuban courts to aid African slaves who did not speak Spanish. Cuban slavery followed medieval Spanish law, the Siete Partidas de Alfonso X, which guaranteed slaves select legal rights. Some cases include complaints by slaves on their own behalf, but many are cases in which slaves were interrogated after uprisings. And Chinese interpreters were also used after the 1860s when a lot of Chinese arrived. Today I'd like to focus on one case I examined in the National Archives from 1833, Banes, Cuba, in which many of the coffee plantation's 375 slaves, most, although not all of whom, we'll stay here, were Yoruba-speaking, Lukumi-speaking, rebelled. The expediente consists of depositions by the few whites who ran the plantation, the owner, the slave's physician, and the overseer, and many African slaves believed to be involved in or have witnessed the uprising. A profoundly multilingual and cosmopolitan Cuba emerges in these transcripts, one that the colonial court, albeit unintentionally, recognized, in contrast to the era's criollo peons to the patria, like José María Heredia's poetry or the tertulias of Domingo del Monte. Yet the numerous alternative communities, desires, liturgies, and narratives that do register in the legal archive remain opaque. Multiple languages are used to investigate the uprising. Multiple religions are appealed to swear in the witnesses. Interpreters are sought from neighboring plantations, presumably to avoid collusion. How transparent are the resulting narratives? Who were the interpreters, about whom scant information exists? African slaves rebaptized with Christian names and allegedly national adjectives, Sebastián Lukumi, Maria Ganga, and so on. In examining these translations, are we, as Pedro asks, working against or with the logic of surveillance that put them on trial in the first place? Interpreting a trial that was facilitated by interpreters from an original language not recorded in the archive introduces additional unknowns. To begin with, the slaves employed as translators may or may have not felt and acted in allegiance with the rebelling cafetal, and may have translated accordingly. But an additional level of non-transparency lies in the fact that the answers we seek today are different than those provided by the responses to the questions. The cases ostensibly attempt to understand why the uprising occurred and who was behind it, in order to punish, and in this case, kill many of the guilty parties. Hence the insistent question that to modern readers seems almost nonsensical. ¿Por qué se levantaron los negros y cuál era el proyecto? First the 1789 Real Cédula, and then after 1842, Reglamentos de Esclavos, prescribed the clothing and food that the slaves were supposed to receive. And so that might be part of the question driving the fiscal's question, why was there a rebellion? But what we think of as the real answer to this question leaps out in other places. The question of what we're reading for and what we're able to see is a difficult one. Jacques Rancière, again a resonance with what we already heard, wrote about his own study of French workers from the same period, Knights of Labor, quote, "We are not going to scratch images to bring truth to the surface. We are going to shove them aside so that other figures may come together," and decompose there. In reading these cases of interpreters, we have to push aside our preconceptions to allow for unexpected answers to come together without imposing what we think we already know, or perhaps without even posing the questions. A passage from the testimony by overseer Diego Barrero in the 1833 case indicates the multiple levels of interpretation involved. Como entre 8 y 9 de la noche, a tiempo que iba a acostarse en la sala de la casa principal, oyó en el bateo una voz que repetía las palabras Hobe, que en la lengua lucumi significa reunión, y seguidamente se agruparon porción de negros a los pasadizos de la casa con mucho alboroto, por lo cual temió unas desgracias, y dirigiéndose a la enfermería preguntó al negro Alejo qué significaba aquello, y por contestación le dijo, carajo, queremos libertad. Okay, so someone in the court translates the lucumi obe into Spanish. And for what it's worth, in Lidia Cabrera's Anago vocabulario lucumi, she has obe meaning cuchillo or herida or machete que mata. And yet the testimony also includes the overseer's question about what all this means. Not just the language, but also the conspiratorial gathering. ¿Qué significaba aquello? He receives in response a startlingly direct answer, replacing the petty explanations of how much food or clothes the slaves received. Because most of the other answers are no, we had enough food, we had enough clothing. Carajo, queremos libertad. In aesthetic theory, Theodore Adorno wrote that, quote, what was once true in an artwork and then disclaimed by history is only able to disclose itself again when the conditions have changed on whose account the truth was invalidated. Aesthetic truth content and history are that deeply enmeshed. The same is clearly true for aspects of this case, in some ways occluded irremediably from view, but in other ways disclosed. And while Adorno's aesthetic theory may seem out of place in a court case, aesthetics are important to this one, which turns on the crucial figures of language, music, and fashion, as I'll describe at the end of the talk. Okay, so the second part, Capital San Salvador, Banes, Cuba. The details of the case accrue through multiple statements. On August 11th, 1833, Don Francisco Aguirre, owner of the Capital San Salvador, left his plantation to travel to Havana. Days before his departure, two contramayorales, or drivers, named Joaquin and Fier Bras, whose given name was Edu, together with the slaves Ago and Bali, were overheard by Ayay, rebaptized Pascual, plotting an uprising, quote, in their tongue. Aguirre had left behind his aged mother, the plantation physician, and the mayordomo, with hundreds of slaves, almost all of them African-born, although some spoke Spanish. In interrogations, the bozales, slaves who did not speak Spanish, blamed the Ladinos, slaves who did, for, quote, dragging the bozales into the rebellion. The Ladinos, in turn, blamed the bozales. There seems to be consensus, however, that Joaquin and Fier Bras convened the slaves and armed them with sticks and stones. They were accused of burning houses in the town of Banes, as well as the neighboring ingenios, the Phoenix and La Catalina. Several men broke into Aguirre's house, smashing the windows with rocks, where an ensuing gust of wind blew out the room's candle. In the darkness, a young slave named Tomas Mina led Aguirre's mother to safety. In scores of depositions, this moment recurs as a focal point. The breaking of the windows is narrated over and over, as is the candle being snuffed out. La señora había logrado escapar en uno de los momentos que se apagó la luz. Se apagó la luz, la que encendieron varias veces y volvió a apagarse. Porción de negros entraron en la sala rompiendo todo, con cuyo momento se apagó la vela. The detail could be a symbol for the task of deciphering the expedient itself. In the obscurity, something escapes. Voices cannot be accurately attributed to their respective bodies. A stubborn kernel resists transparency. About 60 pages into the dossier, the fiscal sends for an interpreter from Lucumi, a slave named Sebastian from the next farm over. Sebastian promises under oath to faithfully carry out the task of translation, and as he cannot write, he signs with a cross. What role did translators like Sebastian play in these accounts? In the records I found, there was little sign of tensions between interpreters and witnesses, suggesting they rendered faithful or at least uncontested translations. As historian Michael Gomez has written, and as visible in the antagonism between Bozales and Ladinos, indeed in the very definition of these terms, language is a critical issue in brokering relations between Africans from different and sometimes recently warring regions and between African slaves and African-born slaves. Language, quote, is both the bridge and the void over which it extends. It is a primary theater of conflict, a principal site of contention, end quote. Language both united and divided slaves, although the organizers of this rebellion included a ganga, along with the Lukumis. Another case from the 1840s evidenced how remaining outside a dominant language group could spell ostracization. In a case concerning a coachman's murdered wife, a slave named Savad, which is possibly the Muslim name Saud, or the Persian Savad, which means both black and literate, is deemed by other slaves to be insane, porque ni lo ha podido entender nadie, ni ella persona alguna, y así ha sido un ente despreciable en la finca. Oddly, despite this apparent ostracization, then this slave appears through a translator testifying to his participation in the murder. So clearly they were able to find someone who understood his language. In the 1833 Banes rebellion, the question of language is ever present. The overseer suggests that though he could not recognize the voices of the conspirators, nor could he understand what they were saying, because pues lo hacían en su idioma, Lucumí, de cuya nación son casi todos, en cuanto a los nombrados Alejo y Joaquín, no le queda duda que eran los que daban órdenes a los otros y hacían cabeza. That is, he did not speak Lucumí, but purported to understand who was organizing the revolt. Nicolás Mina, who brought the mother out of the house, presumably traded via the Portuguese port of São Jorge da Mina, may have spoken Ewe, and he echoes this charge, claiming, en la confusión, en la obscuridad, opacidad, solo conoció al contramayor Luis y Alejo y Joaquín Lucumí, que hablaron lengua a los bozalones. Occasionally, witnesses who spoke Lucumí introduced fragments of a transliterated language that, when read by Yoruba speakers today, still resist translation. Manuela Lucumí, through interpreter Sebastián, claims that on the night of the 13th, Fier Bras began to sing Oni Orde, to which others responded Ofe, the war song in his land, threatening those who did not respond. It's impossible to know in what dialect the words were written. In 21st century Yoruba, I've been told they mean simply he who is blessed. Were the words from another dialect? Did they connote going to war in this context? Were they poorly transliterated? Was Manuela's an accurate account? The linguistic complexity of the cases and the access to otherwise unrecorded testimonies provide insight into a far more nuanced world than costumbrista authors of the period report. These were the very years when the Creoles were trying to begin Cuban literature, starting tertulias, and they did so against a complex background of different languages, religions, and groups. At the same time, the court, which looked no more kindly on independence conspiracies than on anti-slavery movements, demonstrates what we could think of as an empire's understanding of religion, language, and law as comparative. Manuela Lucumí, for instance, is asked to swear to her God that what she has said is true. No siendo cristiana, dicho negra se le preguntó por medio del intérprete si juraba y prometía por el Dios en quien adora decir verdad en cuanto se le pregunta. And a number of defendants, again through an interpreter, are asked if they are aware that rising up against their masters, robbing, killing, arson, and resisting justice are, quote, delitos que en todas partes se castigan con las penas más severas. To which some answer, as did Ayay, por medio del intérprete, que en Guinea también matan a los que matan a otros y que cometen estos delitos, y que aquí, si no hubiera sido por los ladinos, los bozales no hubieran hecho daño. Ayay likens Guinean West African law to Spanish colonial law and blames the ladinos, presented as falling between the two spaces, as the problem. Lucumí, however, is not the only language translated. In the course of the interrogations, several aesthetic rather than narrative items seem crucial elements in getting to the bottom of the uprising. A plumed woman's hat, a red parasol, a doll carried by a queen, a colored skirt, drums, and a wind instrument. Again, Adorno's not out of place here when he says, all artworks are writing, not just those that are obviously such. They are hieroglyphs for which the code has been lost. It's clear in the interrogations that the court understands drums and music to be alternative systems of communication. In 1843, the governor of Cienfuegos asked Cuba's Capitán General to outlaw toque de tambor in order to prevent rebellions. In the Banes case, the court attempts to identify who started the drumming. In other cases, slaves report that revolts began upon hearing estallar el cuero, o como dice, hablar el cuero. Making the drum speak or sound recalls the so-called talking drum, percussion that imitates speech and encodes messages. Such messages constitute a central part of some of the secret societies in the same moment being founded, such as Abakwa, a society derived from the West African cross-river Ekpe or leopard society founded precisely in this moment. Abakwa's members are sworn not to divulge its secrets, including that of playing for non-initiatives, Ekwe, a friction drum, el secreto de los secretos, as Lydia Cabrera called it, a special sound that was supposedly, even into the 1920s, outlawed by Havana police, and only the Sexteto Habanero was allowed to make the sound. So I'm just going to try to play a little bit of it. Do you think it didn't transfer? It's okay. I can play it later. It's not important.
The file might be hard to find.
That's fine. That's fine. It's just 2 moments in 2 moments in which you can hear the sound. In addition to the drums, dress is important to the Banes case. Much is made of the woman's feathers hat and of a parasol, a skirt used by 2 slaves identified by witnesses as the king and queen. The reference to kings and queens suggests roles often associated with cabildos in Cuba and with models of sovereignty from West Africa, but also with new alternative states hinted at elsewhere in the case. And this is the final section. Haitian independence frightened Cuban slave owners in 1804, but fears of black sovereignty within Cuba concretized in the 1812 trial and execution of José Antonio Aponte, an artisan accused of conspiring to establish in Cuba a black state modeled on Haiti, and who had in his library images of Henri Christophe, Toussaint Louverture, and George Washington. The specter of other sovereign territories, from taking over Banes to simply returning to, quote, Tierra de Negros, appears multiple times in the 1833 interrogations. Churipi testifies that Joaquin and Fierabras intended to bring everyone, quote, a Tierra de Negros para ser libres, cuya idea había mucho tiempo que tenía y no había podido realizar, porque eran pocos los negros que había en la finca, pero que habiendo ahora muchos podían llevar el proyecto adelante. Pelú, also through the translator, declares that Luis Lucumí, Gonzalo Mandinga, Valle and Oyo also set out saying they were going to bring people a Tierra de Negros. Tierra de Negros remains a vague referent, and it's not clear if it suggested a departure for Africa, Haiti, or simply the town of Banes. This post-diasporic notion of a land of blacks rubs up against residual political tensions within the group, however. Pelú, for instance, runs away, refusing to join the venture. But the idea of sovereign spaces of freedom within the island echoes evidence from other cases, such as the 1925 testimony by a slave named Lucia, originally from Virginia in the U.S., 40 years old, on the Cafetel Sabanzo, where rebels, she claimed, said they would kill the whites and hacer un estado libre, apoderándose de Matanzas y de La Habana para ello. The free states, the king and queen, the parasol, the plumed hat, the interpreter identified only as Sebastián Lucumí. These fragments seem signs for the code which has not fully been cracked. We have the Spanish, but the Lucumí is missing. We have the names of the translators, but know nothing about them. And yet they were key actors in a cosmopolitan society whose received images we're only beginning to shove aside so that other figures may come together and decompose there.